Hi, everybody. Welcome to the QT2 Systems Training with Power Meter webinar. My name is Amy Javens. I am a QT2 Systems coach, and I am also the QT2 and Team and Training Director. And I am here with QT2 coach Eric Kahl. We are so lucky to have him join us this evening as he presents Training with Power Meter webinar. A little bit history about Eric. We are so fortunate to have him in our QT2 system. Eric Kahl has been competing in triathlons and endurance sports since the mid 1990s. So he's been around for a while, and he has raced in all types of endurance events for a good while, and he's also coached athletes for 2 decades. Anywhere from sprint distance to multiple Ironman events and multi-day adventure races, Eric has competed in. And in addition to his extensive racing experience, Eric has coached hundreds of athletes from first-timers to multiple world championship qualifiers in both the 70.3 and the 40.6 distances. Eric loves to coach athletes who have a passion for their sport, and he believes that no two athletes will ever get the same results by following the same program. The foundation for his coaching is based upon 3 essential key points: an individualized approach to maximize the athlete's ability, consistency, and the right mental attitude. So with that, I'm going to let Eric take this away. Thank you, Eric, so much for doing this for us.
Thank you, Amy, for the great introduction. So let's get this started. So with all of our QT2 presentations, we always like to start with our 5 cornerstones. First one being training. Obviously, we are in the coaching business, so training is what we do. Second cornerstone is restoration and day-to-day nutrition. These 2 fall in the preparatory phase of racing or preparation. And when we combine those 2 with race day feeling and proper pacing, and adding yet the 5th piece of mental fitness, we believe that this is the right combination to execute a perfect race. All right. So before we start digging into power meter, I wanted to make it clear that this is not a power meter is better than heart rate training. They coexist in the perfect world. Power meter is a little bit more stable maybe than heart rate training. It's more consistent. There's a few things that are better about power meter, but this is not to come across as power meter is the only way to train, because if anybody knows our methodology in QT2, we are huge believers in heart rate training and listening to your body. So basically, for the purposes of today, power is the output, or how much force you're putting into something, and heart rate is going to be the measure of how the body is responding to that work. Okay, so that's the input. So power is the output, and heart rate will be the input. All right, so starting from the beginning here. So what is a power meter? Power meter is basically a sensor or a gauge that measures the amount of force that's being applied to, in this case, the bike or the pedals or the cranks, and converts it to a unit which is watts. So everybody understands watts. So right now in the market, there are several different types of power meters. The most common ones are the ones that attach to your bike via the crank arm, or the pedal axle is probably the most popular one right now. In addition to those, it could be on the spider part of the crank. The old version ones used to be in the hub, but also, not to be forgotten, the smart trainers. Anybody that knows the market right now is really hot for smart trainers. People understand that training indoors is great. It's consistent. You can control the environment. So the smart trainers have come a long ways.
Okay.
So you may not have a power meter on your bike, but you may have a power meter on your smart trainer, and therefore the numbers and the watts and everything and all this stuff will work for you just using a smart trainer. Here's a quick picture of exactly where a power meter can be attached. So if you think that the closest point to the force is going to most likely have the most precise measurement. So we start from the pedals here, and I think you guys can see my cursor. And the further down the line you get away from where the power is applied, those numbers are going to variate a little bit more. Back in the days when I first had a power meter, I had a hub power meter. And then a few years later, things got a little bit better, or technology improved, and they came with the bottom bracket power meter. Nowadays, the most popular, again, are the pedals and the crank arm. I won't get into brands and things like that, but you know, there's some good research on the internet if you guys have some questions in regards to that. Okay, so where does it all begin? Functional threshold. By definition, functional threshold is the amount of power, average power that you can sustain for approximately an hour. If anybody has done a 1 hour functional threshold test, they understand how long an hour is at all out effort. So there are a few tests in the market that can predict what your functional threshold value is without actually going full on for 60 minutes. Popular tests are the 30-minute time trial. Sometimes with a newer athlete, I'll have them do a 2 by 8 minute best effort, separated by 10 minutes easy. For the ones that are using the smart trainer, the ramp test is the way to go indoors, based, my opinion on that. Just because to try to do a 30-minute effort indoors, it's greatly harder than outside, just because of wind and lack of motivation and looking at things and getting distracted. So, and then lastly is one of the tests that we do for our athletes, and we call it the 3 and 20. A lot of people mix, or they try to interchange the word critical power with functional power. They're pretty similar, they're not the same. Critical power is the highest intensity one can hold for 30 to 40 minutes, and they use a different way of profiling the athlete once they determine that. And some common terminologies that they use is will be a CP5 or CP20 or CP60, meaning that they will do the best effort at CP60 that they can hold for 60 minutes, or the value for critical power for 20 minutes. But they're not necessarily interchangeable. They're definitely a little bit different. All right, so let's get into the test. So again, for anybody that has a smart trainer, I highly recommend using the ramp test as a way to determine your functional threshold. Anybody that knows me, I'm pretty big with Zwift. I live in Florida, but I love riding indoors just because it's convenient. I can ride at 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't have to worry about cars. I can control the environment. I can control the temperature. So a lot of the indoor training softwares offer a version of the ramp test. It's a lot shorter, even though over here it says it's 25 minutes. Most people will make past 15 or 16 minutes. So basically you start with a 5-minute, very easy warm up. And then after that, the trainer will adjust the resistance every minute. So let me back up here a little bit. So with the smart trainers, they have something that's called ERG, or ERG. That means that basically the trainer is controlling the resistance. It doesn't matter if you shift your gears on the bike or not, the trainer is holding that resistance. So with this test, every minute after the warm-up, the trainer will increase the resistance by a certain percentage, and your goal is to complete as many 1 minute steps as you can until you can't go any further. For most people, the first 10 minutes are fairly easy, and then literally just the last 3 to 5 minutes of the test, the effort gets pretty hard. I'll explain a little bit more about that here in a little bit. So benefits for the ramp test, it's what I call the perfect indoor test, again, because it's short, it's to the point, it hurts less, and we're looking for your best 1 minute sustained power. And again, pacing is not an issue. So a lot of times when athletes go outside, pacing is a big issue. And for best results, athletes should use their smart trainer on erg mode. And most indoor softwares will force you into doing that. All right, so next, let's talk a little bit about our 3 and 20 test. I won't get into the nitty-gritty details here, but basically, we have our athletes go out and do a 10-minute warm-up, and then we have them do a few hard 1 minute effort or 3 minute efforts with a few minutes off in between. And then we're looking for a 3 minute all-out effort. We follow that with a few minutes easy, and then we go into a 10 minutes easy, and then we go into a 20-minute best sustained effort. Now this test, again, I believe it's best done outside. It can be done inside, but the perceived exertion of this test indoors is a lot harder than outdoors. And then the athlete will do a cool down. So we combine these numbers. We have a little formula that we use, and we come up with what the functional threshold is. Again, remember, the true functional threshold is your best sustained effort for up to 60 minutes. But there's some equations that we could use using a shorter version test to get to that number. All right, so functional threshold power. It is my belief, and several other coaches who I speak to often, that it is basically a moving target. Remember, if you tested today and we determined that your functional threshold is 200 watts, 2 weeks from now, it could be a little bit different. 6 months from now, it should definitely be different if you're training properly to increase your functional threshold. So the reason I say that is that, let's say we tested today, this athlete is getting ready to do an Ironman. Because of the effort of an Ironman, it's a long, steady effort. We're not necessarily going to improve their functional threshold, although it happens often, just merely because we improve their aerobic fitness, and therefore anaerobic fitness also improves with that. So it is a moving target, so don't get caught up on what your threshold is today. But the reason I say that again, and I kind of back up for a second, is that when you do your functional threshold test, we need to make sure it's accurate. Okay, how accurate is it? If you did a test indoor, your numbers outdoor may not be the same for 2 reasons. A, because we're using different bikes, different power meters, different brands will vary a little bit. So I often tell my athletes that we're going to use, and hopefully these numbers are close, but we're going to use an indoor functional threshold when you go in indoor, and we're going to use an outdoor functional threshold when you're riding your bike outside. A lot of times these numbers are only within 10 watts, so it's not a big deal. But if you're using an indoor bike that has a different system and we're seeing 30 to 40 watts difference, that makes a big difference. How reliable was your test? Meaning, were you fresh? Was the equipment in good condition? Did you calibrate your power meter? Can you duplicate it fairly closely in a few weeks. I believe that athletes should be checking their functional threshold probably every 4 to 6 weeks. Does that mean that they need to do a full-on test every 4 to 6 weeks? Not necessarily, but using some of the metrics that we're going to talk about today should help them to understand if their target is moving up or down. Okay. Test often, again, 4 to 6 weeks is a good way to do it, especially the indoor with the ramp test. After 5 minutes after the test, you've fully recovered. So you could test probably twice in a week or 3 times in a week, and it would not have a negative effect. Again, I talked about the indoor versus the outdoor numbers. They're not always the same. And or is your functional threshold relatable to other gauges? So in this case, specifically in this case, I like to compare your power zones with your heart rate zones. And if we see over a few weeks of training that the zones are not moving in the right direction, that could be an indicator that your functional threshold has changed, and therefore it should be adjusted. All right. From what I know, there is no standard zones for endurance sports. As far as I know, I can tell you that I probably know of at least 15 to 20 different zone standards or zone numbers or names that different companies and different coaches use to determine their zones for their athletes. So the zones that I'm going to share here next is what we use at QT2. These are, even though the names may be similar to other people, the numbers that we use to figure those out, or the formula or the percentage of your threshold, may not be the same. So these are the zones that we use.
Eric, before you move on, we do have a question about the slide before this, about indoor, outdoor testing for FTP. So the question is, when testing outdoors, does the terrain and weather conditions matter? And, if you're on flat roads, where you're at, obviously in Florida, you're on flat roads, but in the New England area or elsewhere where there might be rolling or hilly hills, what do you recommend as far as testing outdoors? And if you're in an area that there's not many flats available?
Yes, great question. Thank you, because I should have covered that. The terrain outdoors definitely affects it. The weather outdoor will affect it. Again, I live in Florida, so I normally tell my athletes, try to find a road that you could go. I prefer doing out and backs because if there is a little bit of a wind going one direction, you're going to have the wind on the opposite direction. Preferably, it should be done on a flat terrain, but it can definitely be done on a hilly terrain as well. I've had athletes that improve their FTP doing a race. They literally went out and it was a hilly course, and they gutted themselves out, and they showed that they had improved their FTP doing the bike portion of a race. The big thing is it should be a place that you can duplicate it and go back out a few weeks later and do it again. Obviously, wind is a factor, cold and heat will be a factor, but I think that's more regional, and athletes will probably get used to that once they do it a few times. All right, let me know if I answered that question properly. If not, we'll do it again.
Is there something you can do if you're on a more rolling terrain by looking at average normalized power versus average power?
Yes. Yep. So I'm going to touch on that here very soon, but that's a great question. So the problem is with the rolling terrain is that athletes tend to push harder going uphill, and then they tend to coast on the downhill. So that throws your numbers off. But if it's a hill that's long enough that you could go out and do, even if it was a 20-minute effort, sometimes we can look at FTP based on that. But terrain does make it's harder sometimes to look at it, just because if the athlete can't find a fairly straight road that they can bike for, an out and back, sometimes we got to get a little creative, and like you said, use data that exists already, or formulate workouts that we can use their data to come up with their functional threshold. And again, that goes back to functional threshold is a moving target. That athlete that has trained on the rolling terrain, and we're kind of using these ways of figuring out their FTP. Maybe if we put them in Florida where they can go, 10 miles straight out, turn around and come back on a flat terrain, they may be able to do better or worse. So don't get stuck with that number. And a lot of times I'll talk to athletes and I'll say, hey, when was the last time, when I'm interviewing an athlete, like, when was the last time you did your FTP test? Oh, probably about a year and a half. I'm like, well, that's probably not a valid number. And that throws off all the other metrics that I'll cover here in a little bit. Oops, sorry. Let me jump here. So this is a quick screen of what we use for our zones. ZR is what we call a recovery zone. Anything below 65% of FTP. Z1 is our aerobic zone. The range that we use is 65 to 79% of FTP. Zone 2 is a tempo effort, 79 to 89% of FTP. And then zone 3 is a sub-threshold. We do have one more zone that's not labeled there. It's what we call BST or BSE, which is our best sustained effort. Those are normally used for shorter duration intervals, not used as much. So I just want to focus on the top 4 here. All right, the biggest thing, going back to everything I just mentioned, is if your FTP is not accurate on Training Peaks or whatever software that you use to look at this data, all the data that we're going to be covering now won't make sense because those numbers are not accurate. So garbage in equals garbage out when you're looking at data. So that's why it's important to test often. Okay, so average power, probably the simplest of the metrics that we're going to look at. Basically, you go for a ride and the computer will average every single second of the ride and give you an average number. Everybody understands average, so I won't go into that too much. Again, this is the simplest metric. It's just a quick, dirty way to say, oh, look, today I averaged 200 watts. Now, normalized power. That is basically a upscale or upgraded version of average. So basically what normalized power does is that it gets rid of the coasting, it gets rid of the zeros, and it assigns a feel metric to the ride. So a rider that's doing a lot of intervals will have a higher normalized power than their average power. On the flip side of that, somebody that lives on the flat terrain that can keep a steady effort can likely have their average power and the normalized power be pretty close. And I basically just mentioned that. So it's a variable. The variation between the normalized power and the average power is something that we look at, especially for races or events that we want the athlete to pace the bike portion properly. Again, I mentioned that lax of surges in power. Sorry, somebody was talking to me here. So lack in surges in power reduces the physiological cost of the effort. So there is a higher cost when you're doing intervals than on a steady effort. All right, so in a nutshell, it's normalized power takes into account the variance in between a steady ride and a fluctuating workout. So here's an example. A rider will sit on the trainer, and the reason I'm using the trainer is for anybody that has ridden with power outside, it's very hard to keep your power consistent at whatever number that is, let's say 200 watts. So we're on the trainer, it's a lot easier because you don't have to coast, there's no cars, there's no traffic lights, there's no wind, it's just a steady, consistent effort. So a rider can ride 60 minutes at about 200 watts. It'll feel easy for some, but the average power and the normalized power will be pretty close. The opposite of that is a rider that's riding on the hilly terrain, and they're spending upwards of a minute pushing, I don't know, 300-400 watts, and then they get to the top of the hill and then they coast down for a minute or whatever it is. Their overall average might still be 200 watts, but their normalized power is likely to be a lot higher because it's taken into consideration those harder efforts. So again, normalized power assigns like a feel effect to the ride, and I'll explain that a little bit more here next. So this picture here, this athlete is riding indoors, and if you guys can see the gray line in the background, this is basically a straight uphill ride. All right, but the objective was for this rider to ride as consistent as possible for an hour. So if you look at the power numbers, which are the green, the yellow lines, they're pretty average. His FTP is 271. So if you look at the results here on the right, his average power was 249, and his normalized power was 253. Again, this is pretty close. So this is a steady ride. Now let's look at this file here. This was a group ride where you can see that the peaks and valleys on the power numbers are tremendous. So this ride will have a much higher cost on how it feels than the steady ride above. So for the second ride, his average power was 218, so lower than the first ride. His normalized power was 270. Okay, so he basically rode an hour worth of, the cost of this ride for an hour was just below his functional threshold. Okay, so this validates that his functional threshold is where it is because he was able to ride this hard. Again, these are some of the things that we can look at it. Because his numbers were done correctly, I'll explain IF later on, right down here, he's getting a value of 1, which is the hardest that, it's basically justifying that this is where his FTP is. I'll try not to jump ahead of where I'm going next. Any questions so far? Yes, no, okay, moving on. So aerobic decoupling, okay, so power to heart rate ratio. This is by far the number one metric that I look at pretty much every workout, okay? So this is basically the relationship in between your power zone or your power effort and how your heart rate is responding to the effort, okay? I like using for longer rides, anything over 2 hours, especially for an Ironman or for an athlete training for an Ironman. We'll start at the 2 hours and see where his aerobic, if there's any decoupling. And if they're doing good, we start bumping up those rides, and we can actually literally see at what point of the ride his fitness is starting to fail. Okay, so the goal is always to keep your aerobic decoupling below 5%. I actually like 3% better for steady rides, especially later in the season where the fitness should be better, but 5% is the gold standard. Again, this is just a great tool to determine if the athlete's endurance, aerobic endurance is there before we progress into a next phase or a longer ride or something like that. All right, so here's an example of an indoor ride. So this athlete rode, 3 hours and 40 minutes indoor. Their power to heart rate ratio was only a 1.97. So let's say 2%. This is not the best example because I forgot to get rid of some of the noise here on the file. But if you look at the pink line, that will be his power. And then the red line just above it, that is the heart rate. So you can see that for the first 3 hours of this ride, both the heart rate and the power were traveling parallel to each other. Somewhere around the 3-hour mark here, you can see that the power stayed consistent, but the heart rate started to creep up, okay? So other term that people use is heart rate lagging, or I like decoupling better, so I'm gonna stay with that. And lagging wasn't the word, I'm gonna come back here in a minute. But basically it's the relationship in between your heart rate and your power with the duration of the ride. Okay, so here's another file, a better file to look at. This is from one of my athletes that raced Kona last year. He lives up north. He was not able to do a good heat acclimatization plan just because life got in the way a lot. So if you look at the first half of the ride, which is basically to the top of Hawaii over here, again, the power is the bottom number, the purple, and the heart rate is the upper line here, the red one, pretty consistent for the first half of the ride. And then the second half, you can see where the power is actually getting lower, but the heart rate did not come down as much as the power went down. So this is a classic aerobic decoupling. What causes this, what in this case was not fitness, in this case was lack of hydration. So he started getting dehydrated halfway through the bike ride. You could tell that he wasn't sweating. He made adjustments. The goal for this ride was for him to ride a little bit harder than he did, but he was able to identify that the heart rate was creeping up, even though the power was staying steady. So he made adjustments and backed down everything to minimize the nuclear meltdown on the marathon portion. But this is what it looks like. So your heart rate goes one way and the power tends to come down, heart rate tends to go up. I have another one here somewhere, I'll find it. Kilojoules. To oversimplify this, this is basically the caloric expenditure of whatever amount of time, whatever ride you do. It's not something that I look all the time. Actually, we can go back here on this ride and look at it. So for this athlete that rode sub 5 hours for 112 miles, he burned about 4,200 kilojoules. Again, it's not identical to calories, but it's pretty comparable. So we can actually use this data to make sure that his nutrition and his calories are appropriate during a long bike ride. How to use it, I just explained it there. Basically, because of the efficiency of us riding a bike, we can actually use this for body composition improvements, or making sure the athlete is consuming enough calories on the bike. But you'll never get to the point that, oh, I'm burning 4,000 kilojoules, I should take in 4,000 calories. That is not exactly how it works, but it just gives us a baseline of where to start. Okay, all right, so watts per kilo. This is a fun one. This is not necessarily one that I look at every ride. Actually, I rarely look at this one, but it's something that is important to look at regularly to make sure that we are going in the right direction. So as the name says, this is it's a ratio between how much of an athlete weighs and how much power they can generate. The higher, the better. So a lot of times this is something that I look at to compare FTP tests throughout the year. So every time they do an FTP, I'm going to say, what's your current weight? And then we can compare apples to apples, because it's possible that an athlete gained weight and therefore is able to push more power, but that would affect their power to rate ratio last time they weighed a little bit less, but put in the same amount of power. It just gives us a baseline to look at. So the typical example is 200-pound athlete that has a 250 watts FTP. Their power to weight ratio is 2.8 FTP. Okay, so let's say this was early in the season and we were able to lose a few pounds, in this case 10 pounds, so his power to weight ratio goes up. From a coach standpoint, from an athlete standpoint, most athletes can afford to lose a little, 10 pounds on a regular basis. Not every athlete, but there's always a little bit of, there may be some weight that we could lose. And in a lot of times, it is easier to lose 5 pounds or 10 pounds than it is to gain 10 watts for certain athletes if they're already at prime. I think I just mentioned there, comparing FTP results. Another good way that I actually use this personally is if I'm going on Zwift and I want to do a group ride and I want to make sure it's not too much of a hard ride if it's a recovery day for me or something. So on Zwift, when they have the pacers, the ride is described and they'll give an idea. This is a 1.8 watts per kilogram ride or a 2.1 or a ratio in this case. So for this athlete at 250 pounds, 200 pounds and 250 FTP, if they rode in between 1.8 and 2.1 kilos watts per kilos, they will be riding at about a Z1 effort. Because of gravity, obviously the lighter you are, in theory, the easier it is for you to climb hills. So a lot of times we may do a power to weight ratio section on a hill saying, all right, I want you to try to hold a 3.0 watts per kilogram going up this hill, because if you go a lot higher than that, it'll have some costs or some consequences, I guess. All right, so just some fun facts over here. High level athletes in the triathlon right now are likely to have a 4 to 4.7 watts per kilogram at FTP, okay, where the straight cyclists, some of the elite and the professionals are above 7, or definitely in the 6 to above 7 watts per kilogram. It is said that Lance Armstrong at one point had a 7.0 watts per kilogram. I would assume that a lot of these riders nowadays are actually higher than that, just because they're so light and they can push so much power. Mark Cavendish, the famous sprinter, it is known that he can actually push 20 watts per kilogram for an average of 20 seconds during a sprint, or the equivalent to 600 watts. For anybody that understands watts, that's a lot of watts. I mean, I don't think I personally have ever pushed more than 1,000. So these guys are pushing upwards of 1,600 for 20 seconds consistently doing those sprints in the Tour de France. A good time to look at, again, watts per kilo, as I mentioned earlier, look beginning of the season, middle of the season, end of the season, a solid plan, training plan, combined with purposeful strength training throughout the year, with a good nutrition plan, can help athletes improve their power to weight ratio. All right, so we're getting close to the end here. So intensity factors. So I'm going to start putting everything that I've talked about together on the next few slides here, so you guys hopefully get a better understanding for what you should be looking at or we look at most of the rides. So intensity factor, that is the ratio of your normalized power, okay, not to be confused with your average power in your FTP. So normalized power to your FTP. A ride that it's a 0.8 intensity factor suggests that you rode at about 80% of your FTP, okay? I'll explain a little bit more of this on the next slide. So it can help you gauge your FTP Okay, so if somebody can ride, if all of a sudden you look at a result or after a ride or a race, and the athlete rode an equivalent of 1.05 intensity factor during a 60-minute ride, there's an improvement for their FTP, so their FTP should be adjusted on whatever software you monitoring them. We use Training Peaks, it's very friendly, and most of the images you guys are seeing are coming from Training Peaks. Okay. So here's another example. This athlete rode 56 miles. We talked about how much quote unquote caloric cost they had. So it was about 2,200 kilojoules. His normalized power was 280 watts. His average power was 274. So even though you guys are not going to answer, was this a steady ride or was this a ride with lots of intervals? Our answer for you, this was a pretty steady ride, okay? His intensity factor was a 0.8, so he rode at 80% of his FTP, okay? Another good way, I won't jump into that. I was gonna start going down a rabbit hole here, but I'll stay out of it. Okay, so here's another example. So, and I forgot to mention this earlier, all of these data points that I'm talking about, you can look at it at the entire ride, or you can look at it at segments of the ride. So for example, for this ride here, the total ride was over 2 hours, and this person rode 40 miles, but I'm only analyzing this set of intervals right here that he had to do 3 rounds of 6-minute efforts with short recoveries, okay? So the intensity factor for just this section here was 1.11. We were working on some upper numbers just because he was going to be doing some races that had some short punchy hills. So we wanted to play around and start including those there just to gain some strength. So in this case, the 1.11 intensity factor is only for this 30-minute segment here. All right, so another way that we could use intensity factor when we're designing a workout as a coach or even as an athlete, you know, I want to do a ride and I want to add, in this case here, 3 by 8 minutes power at our zone 2, which is our tempo effort. So by using Training Peaks, it's telling me that when I design this workout, it's giving me the equivalent of 0.76 intensity factor. Okay, so that this athlete goes out and completes the workout, and the result is a 0.78. The discrepancy of the numbers here is not something to be worried about, but it just tells me that this athlete completed the workout fairly well, and we accomplished what we looked at. Even though we spent almost 30 minutes at a tempo effort, this is still considered somewhat of an aerobic workout just because of the overall intensity factor. All right, TSS. So training stress score. So every ride that you do, every workout you do produces stress. That's how we improve our fitness. And stress is a good thing. And with the right amount of stress applied, we can improve fitness. So every workout will have a TSS score assigned to it. So basically quantifies the workout. The individual workout will have TSS, or will accumulate TSS. A whole week's worth of workouts will have an assigned TSS, and an entire block of training will have a different assigned TSS. And that's how we as coaches look at it, and are we applying the right amount of stress to our athletes for them to improve, okay? And then on the bottom one here, how do we use TSS? The typical example, a ride that scores 100 TSS equals that you pretty much did a functional threshold ride for an hour. in a ride that scores a 15 to 30 TSS was a gentle recovery ride, okay? And you're gonna see examples here. So here are two files from two 70.3s, a few weeks of, actually these were 5 weeks apart. I want to say the top one was Grand Rapids and the bottom one was Ohio 7.3, same athlete. Okay, so I'm starting to put everything together now. First race, his kilojoules are about the same, so we're not going to compare that. His normalized power for the first race was 290. Was that two? Yeah, 290. For the second race, he rode a little bit harder, 294. The first ride, I just lost my train of thought here. Here's my train. Okay, so for the first ride, his TSS was 145. For his second, this file, the second file, his TSS was 155. Okay, the fun thing here is, if anybody was paying attention, is that even though these numbers are pretty close, the intensity factor for his first ride is a 0.8, and the intensity factor for the second file is a 0.84. So right here, it tells me that we have improved some of the fitness, and I know that his functional threshold have just improved before that. So we were able to ride a little bit harder on the second ride than we did on the first one. Okay, so the goal was a little bit different. Here's a great example that his power to heart rate ratio stayed pretty consistent on both rides. So the first one, he only had a 3% decoupling. So you can see the numbers, the power and the heart rate kind of traveled fairly close together all day. On the second race, a little bit later, it was June, so it was a little bit warmer. He still stayed below 5%. And you can pretty much see that these lines stay parallel to each other until towards the last part of the race. But overall, we're still below 5%. So very acceptable. All right, this is a cool little cheat sheet that we can use to help athletes understand the cost of doing an Ironman at certain percentages. I won't go deep into this, but we can say, so if an athlete wants to do a 5 hour and 20 Ironman bike, we can help determine where the power zone or the intensity factor should be, and at what cost, how much TSS it will produce. When we're training for this race, we would have to, so let's say this athlete wants to ride at 70% and you want to try to do this bike ride in 5 hours and 20 minutes. Has he done any rides that accumulated 261 TSS? Was he able to run off the bike well after that? So we could use these numbers to help our athletes understand on where they should be or where they shouldn't be. So if they race on the white here, they probably could have ridden a little harder. Most age groupers are going to fit on the lighter gray range. Most top 20% on the age group will probably be on the darker gray. Anything above that, you better be a darn good runner, or it's going to make it for a very long day. And we don't even encourage anything above the yellow. Okay, we're getting there. So EF, efficiency factor. It's basically the ratio between your normalized power and heart rate. Again, heart rate, it's always part of the equation. We always bringing it back together. So this one is the one, again, I personally don't look at this all the time. This is better for endurance rides. And I like to use this when I assign the athlete the same workout over period of several weeks. So if they did this workout this month, we might repeat the exact same workout 3 to 4 weeks later and start comparing how did the athlete complete this workout, what do the numbers look like. That's where efficiency factor comes in. Again, great tool to assess aerobic fitness. I just said that this is better done with the endurance rides and not rides with lots of intervals. All right, and here is an example, again, of a long indoor ride. His efficiency factor was a 2.14. Had he done this ride before, and the efficiency factor was lower than this, we can now prove that there has been some aerobic fitness gains over the last block. Okay, so this is a good one because we can compare a lot of things that we talked about. So 3.5 hours on the bike, it was about 4,000 kilojoules. His normalized power was 314, and his average power was 306. So fairly close. His power to heart rate ratio, well within the limits at 1.94, so below 2%. That's fantastic. And then the intensity factor of this ride was a 0.87. So this is definitely a hard ride for this athlete. But the overall numbers were great. So basically, I use this to show the athletes how their fitness are improving without, with valid numbers, basically. All right, I just talked away for, I guess, the last 40 some minutes. Hopefully I was able to answer lots of your questions and not get you too confused. I mean, this power, talking about this stuff could go forever, so I try to keep it fairly simple. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and start shooting questions now, and if not, I'll make myself available by email or get a hold of Amy, and I can always help answer some of these questions.
Feel free to type anything in the chat box for Eric. If you feel comfortable, we have such a small group. Feel free to come off your mic and to ask a question. I know there was a lot of information. Eric, I'm glad you went down some of those rabbit holes because we love numbers.
I know. I started to see myself going down the path. I'm like, no, come back.
But it was excellent. Thank you so much. It was a beautiful presentation, and the visuals just really helped drive home those concepts. Anybody, athletes, coaches who are in the crowd here, do you have any questions for Eric here tonight? Don't be shy. We'll wait a few seconds.
It means I did a great job. That's all I got to say. No, just kidding.
I also, in the chat, I put Eric's email. I put my email, and I also put our content director's email, Reem Jissy. So if you have any questions that you think of at a later time, feel free to email us, or if you want this recording, which we will release in the next day or so, it also will be on our YouTube channel. So feel free to go into our QT2 Systems YouTube channel because we always release those recordings there. We have a question. Can I use my FTP from the trainer on the road?
Yes and no. I would recommend, in the perfect world, you would be able to test both of them, just because the on the trainer is a whole different system. Even though the smart trainers are really smart, the numbers may vary a little bit from your power meter on the bike. Best thing to do would be to maybe validate that with some shorter efforts, and maybe just use your RPE to make sure that it feels the same. I can tell you 200 watts on the road, for me, feels easier than 200 watts on the trainer. It could just be the indoor effect. But the numbers should be fairly close if your power meters are well calibrated.
Also a motivational factor too, right? Like
absolutely,
when we're out racing, sometimes we see such better numbers just because we are in the act of racing and not staring at our wall in our trainer's room.
Yeah.
Great question. Any other questions?
And Christopher, I saw your question here. If I didn't answer your question earlier, just go ahead and shoot me an email later, and I love to to chat with you on the phone if I need to, just kind of help you answer your questions with the rolling hills and things like that. I know it's difficult. I mean, we live in Florida. We can ride flat for 6 hours, never see a hill. True story. We use overpasses as hill repeats here in Florida. So we're fortunate when it comes to that, but we do have the wind.
All right. Thank you so much, Eric, and everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. We really appreciate you joining us. As I said, feel free to visit our YouTube channel, QT2 Systems, for this recording, and plus many other recordings, our podcasts that we launched this year, our other topics and webinars that we have done throughout the year, plus future ones to come. And feel free to visit our new website. It is pretty much all under all pretty much done with construction, so feel free to visit our new website because all of our latest podcasts, blogs, and videos are also on the QT2 Systems website. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Eric.
All right,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you, Amy. Till next
All
one.
right.
All right,
All
bye-bye.
right. Bye, everybody.